Recently, I've noticed something doing the rounds on the internet, um, which is the claim that Donald Trump didn't start any wars. Now, on surface value, if we look at this, it is true. He didn't start any new wars as a foreign policy matter. But this requires a bit more scrutiny because it's kind of being used um, to elevate Trump to something that he's not, and it's being used to disparage his predecessors. And I think it's very, very misleading. So if we look at the basic claim, he didn't start any new wars. That's true. Okay. He didn't launch any military adventures in anywhere that wasn't already a war zone. Um, I don't think that can be refuted. But then we get into what is the definition of war. Now, I've just seen a chart that shows Trump's five predecessors. That is Obama, Clinton, the two Bushes, and Reagan, and a list of the wars that they started, or at least, I think more accurately, were involved in. Why does this matter? It matters because there's a huge difference between starting a war, as with the Iraq War of 2003, which was very clearly started by the United States and Britain and their allies, versus intervention to a war that is already going on, as is the case with Syria and Libya. I get quite annoyed when I see more than annoyed. I get frustrated when I see people make these lazy sort of lists, like you know um, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. Like it's all exactly the same thing. It's not. It's really not. Each of these conflicts requires an analysis of their own context, their own history, and the situation around them. So, taking this rule that Trump didn't start any wars, okay, well, in that case, Obama's intervention against Assad and against ISIS and against the Gaddafi regime wasn't starting a war either, because those were wars that were already going on. The war in Libya started in early 2011 when Gaddafi brutally crushed protests against his regime. And yeah, I'm well aware that there was Islamist factions, and we now know that Libya is in many ways a failed state. But it's a very, very misleading narrative to say that America and the West just start these wars. Why? Because it mitigates brutal dictators who only understand the language of brute force. Um, So to be clear here, my position is not criticizing Donald Trump, but the fact of the matter is he did order military action um, against the Assad regime when it used chemical weapons. He ordered military action against ISIS. His administration, of course, famously assassinated both Qasem Soleimani of Iran and Baghdadi, the figurehead of ISIS. The Trump administration also used the largest conventional bomb in history, the Moab, the so-called mother of all bombs, in Afghanistan. I think it was 2017. At the time, it purportedly killed 90 Taliban fighters. Now, with aerial bombardment, that's always a potentially risky area because there is a risk of civilian casualties. I hate the term collateral damage. I think it's quite callous and dismissive. Now, to be clear here, I'm not sort of acting as an apologist for all Western foreign policy. I personally opposed the Iraq War. I actively opposed it, actually. I was on marches against it. But you can't just lump all these things together like they're one and the same thing. I think that's just lazy, it's intellectually dishonest, and it plays straight into the hands of people whose worldview is the West is to blame for everything. But let's just get rid of this idea that Donald Trump was a pacifist, because if you're going to take the logic of not starting new wars, then I would say, well, the sort of conflicts that are associated with Obama, did he start those? Because there's a difference between intervention and starting a war. Um, and when brutal dictators slaughter their own people, I believe that there is a moral obligation for the international community to respond. Um, but the Trump people who are saying Trump didn't start any wars, they're trying to mold him as some sort of pacifist, which he wasn't. So it's dangerously misleading. Yes, that this is, but to be honest, it goes beyond Trump. It goes into the West's role in the world, America's role in the world. When is American might justified? When is it not justified? One thing about this subject is there's no question about it. Every American president has innocent blood on their hands because no matter how cautious these strikes are, there will almost always be civilian casualties. And it's irrefutable that in Afghanistan, weddings have been bombed. There's no getting away from that. It may not be deliberate in the way that terrorist groups do it, but that's of no comfort to someone who's seen their family slaughtered by bombs, whether they be American or Russian. Um, but there is a difference. Terrorist groups like ISIS specifically, deliberately target civilians. When NATO kills civilians, it's I don't want to say collateral damage because that's callous, but it isn't a deliberate attack on civilians. Very often, terror groups hide behind them. That's irrefutable. So, these situations are not black and white. If we listen to the likes of the Stop the War coalition, then the evil Americans are to blame for everything. And we'll just turn a blind eye to Russian bombing and the brutality of dictators like Assad. One of the biggest tragedies of the 2010s decade, in my opinion, was the industrial scale distortion of Russian state media, particularly regarding the Syria war. And that single handedly, I think, helped to prop up the genocidal Assad regime, which is despicable. But, if you're going to judge that Trump didn't start any wars, then hold the same standard when we're talking about intervention, because that's not the same as starting a war. I appreciate that some of my subscribers won't agree with this. They won't agree with my views on foreign policy, but there has to be a consistency. And the idea that Trump's a pacifist, it just doesn't square up to the facts.